Open any paper, read any property blog or listen to any podcast, you can't help hear about the current housing crisis. But my guest today, Ross Elliott, who's a respected voice in urban economics, is going to challenge some of our preconceived notions about the housing market. In a recent blog post, Ross argued that, contrary to popular belief, we don't have a housing supply crisis, but rather a growth crisis. And in another blog, he explained why we can't solve the problem by building more apartments. So today we explore the dynamics of supply and demand in the housing market, the challenges of finding suitably zoned land for construction, and the impact of our rapid rising population growth in our cities. We're also going to delve into the broader implications of this growth from infrastructure to public services. So if you're interested in property, there's going to be lots of information for you today. In fact, this is an episode you won't want to miss. So let's delve into this thought-provoking conversation with Ross Elliott.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Everyone knows that we're in the middle of a housing supply crisis and building more apartments is the way out, isn't it? Well, is that really true? Ross Elliott, a renowned urban economist and commentator, is here with me today to share his insights into housing affordability. Ross has been stirring up some discussion with his recent blog posts suggesting that building more apartments isn't the solution to our affordability crisis. And when it comes to urban planning, Ross is somebody not only I listen to, but so do governments as his Director of Suburban Alliance, Chair of the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Initiative, Chair of Urban Land Institute of Brisbane, plus a heap more credentials. So today I want to delve into the realities of the housing market, the complexities of construction economics, and maybe some lessons we can learn from cities in other parts of the world. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me back.
Well, you mentioned in a recent blog post that we don't have a housing supply crisis. What are you on about?
Well, I suppose I'm poking the bear a little bit, but I think we need to call out some of the narrative which is going unchallenged. Now, we seem to be flailing ourselves at the moment because there clearly are housing shortages, don't get me wrong, but we seem to attribute that simply to a supply-side problem. And we all know that it's actually called the law of supply and demand. It's not just the law of supply. And I guess what I'm trying to say there is that we've come through a period of fairly record home building just up until prior to COVID. But what's exacerbated the problem now is that we've opened our immigration numbers to absolute record levels when we already had some clear pinch points in the market. And it's the last thing you would do, surely, is to flood the economy with record numbers of people, aim for record levels of population growth when you've got a building and construction industry that's struggling, where builders are going broke, and we've got a planning system that is no longer flexible or very responsive and takes an awful long time to navigate and at great expense to get a decision. So what I'm suggesting, we actually have a growth crisis, not just a housing supply crisis.
Well, it depends whose figures you look at, but the budget had some forward estimates, and since then I've seen other people's forward estimates, and it could well mean we've got another 1.5 million people in Australia in the next 3 years. That it takes into account natural population growth, temporary visas, and the permanent visas. That means we've got to build 5 Canberras in the next 3 years or so, Ross.
Well, exactly, Michael. And I guess, what has history taught us? It's that we're not all that great at growing at slow or modest rates because our infrastructure clearly isn't keeping up. And literally blind Freddie can see that every night on the news. We're faced with hospital shortages, rampings, there are school shortages. Congestion is a measure of an excess of demand over supply because the road system hasn't grown. Many of our cities, I've said this before, I think on one of your podcasts, predicted to increase in number by about a third over the next 15 years, by a third. Now, there are no Western economies or Western cities and Western economies that I have seen where the growth is anything like that number. It's around 10% for other cities that we like to benchmark ourselves. The only cities trying to grow that fast are Shanghai and Beijing, and they do development at the end of a rifle. So, I think we've just got to cool our jets a little bit in terms of this growth challenge. And there are people who say, look, we need more workers to build the houses. But I'm not so sure that is anything much more than some sort of thinly disguised Ponzi scheme promoted by some of the big business interests who want cheap labour and some of the cheaper developers who want lots of buyers for apartments. So I'm just not buying that whole narrative about it's all due to a housing supply crisis.
Sure. Well, clearly it is supply and demand. Supply is one of the issues, of course, and you've mentioned before that bringing land onto the market is a lengthy and costly process. Is there any way of streamlining it? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, it's something I've been looking at for more time than I'd care to admit, Michael, but really we've built ourselves a planning and regulatory system. And I'm not even going to blame the bureaucrats here because most of this has been driven by community saying, we don't want this, we do want this, we want more say in this, we want less say in that, all that sort of thing has led to a much more convoluted planning and regulatory system. We've put fences around our cities in the belief that sprawl is bad and density is good. We suffer from myths that growth on urban outskirts is going to lead to all this congestion because those people out there are all going to want to commute in here to the inner city to work. And we've demonstrated time and again that the census for each capital city shows that variously it's 80 or 90% of people actually live and work in suburban areas and they're not commuting to the city. So if you want to grow in the outer suburbs, you can, and it will not necessarily lead to more inner city congestion. So we've got planning myths, we've got a massive regulatory red tape. We've crueled the system with outrageous, in some cases, just totally exorbitant, out of proportionate fees and conditions that are attached to development. We've increased standards, and some might say nothing wrong with that, until you get to the point where the cost of obliging those standards means that you're faced with delivering uneconomic product, stuff that people can't afford any longer. So it is a very tangled mess, Michael, and this mess has been created over a long period of time too, by the way. I mean, we can't claim it's come as a surprise. Otherwise, it's a bit like saying you were taken by surprise by a sloth.
Yes.
I mean, we've taken 20, 30 years to create this mess, and there is no single silver bullet.
Now, you're based in Brisbane, where there is a very large council that looks after urban planning in a large area. But in the other states, in my state, in Victoria and in New South Wales, lots of local councils have a say on what can be built and what can't be built there. And they're, I guess, being directed by their constituents, the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. Are local councils at fault not allowing the right sort of development to occur?
I don't know that you can blame. I'm fortunate to not live in Sydney, where I think there's 30-something councils across the metropolitan area, and in Melbourne I think there's 14, broadly. So they are smaller jurisdictions. In fact, Sydney City Council, you can just about walk around that in a day, and I think about the same applies for Melbourne, whereas in Brisbane you'd be out for days and days and days walking our boundary. I don't think it's an issue of federal government versus state government versus local government. I think it's an issue of they're not all working together. And the states take a lot more responsibility for planning in, for example, in Victoria under the VPA, which I think does a very commendable job from what I can see. The councils, though, are not woven into that sort of policy-making process as much as perhaps they could be, and the same might apply in Sydney. So you have policy discord. So the federal government, the reason we have record immigration at the moment is a deliberate policy decision of the federal government, who are not accountable in any way for the calamity this is causing in terms of people sleeping rough and having no houses to live in or shelter. So the federal government says this is not our responsibility. This is a job for the states or for the local governments. And yet they're the ones who are contributing to part of the problem, and yet they're not working together with the states and local governments to coordinate a population strategy or a housing and settlement strategy or what was done many years ago under the federal Better Cities initiative under the Hawke-Keating government, going back that far, which was a much more supportive approach to recognising that with growth comes responsibility to support infrastructure upgrades. We don't have that.
I guess you'd probably want to put the housing minister and the immigration minister in the same room and talk to each other. That may help.
Anything's got to be better than what we have at the moment, Michael.
But you also mentioned in your blog, and I'll link to that in the show notes, that apart from the challenge of not having sufficient housing, our rapid growth means that we haven't got sufficient hospital beds, schools, public transport, soft infrastructure, even potable water and energy. How do you see these issues being connected to the housing situation?
Well, sadly, I don't think they will be. And to an extent, that's, I think, why I'm just trying to call out some of the nonsense of saying we've got a housing supply crisis, as if housing supply is the only problem. There's plenty more issues that ought to be alerting people to the fact that we have a growth crisis. We're growing faster than our ability to keep up, and as a result, we're eroding our quality of life and our standard of living.
And that's a real shame. Okay, so some people would say, well, that's real easy. We will build more high-rise apartment buildings, just like they do overseas. What's your argument against that?
There's no argument against it, except that if affordability...
It's not financially viable is the answer, really, is it?
Well, it's much more expensive. So the irony here is that the high-density, the high-rise apartment, which is favoured by some urbanists as, the solution to sprawl is we'll just pack everyone in near the inner city, near jobs that they don't actually have in the inner city, but we'll pack them all in these high-rise apartments. That's the way we'll solve affordability, by bringing all this supply onto the market, except that is the most expensive form of housing on a per square metre basis you can possibly do. The cheapest form of housing, ironically, is the old, what we would call the stick and brick on a slab, the old project home, right? Single level project home, 2-car, 3-bedroom, ensuite, shared bathroom on these days a 350 square metre block of land.
It's getting smaller and smaller, isn't it, Ross?
Getting smaller and smaller. The build cost of those is still, you can get them for $300,000 in this market, and it might be slightly more in Sydney and Melbourne, but that's just the build cost. Of course, then you've got to add the land cost. But even so, if you just look at the build cost, it's a fraction of what a high-rise apartment costs. You don't address affordability by trying to create more of the least affordable type of housing product. It's just a nonsense.
Okay, so statistics suggest that the cost of building high-rise towers has increased by about 50% since the beginning of COVID. And then, of course, there's all the planning issues and the fact that there aren't people prepared to pre-commit to them, since we don't have as many overseas investors coming anymore. All this means is building new apartment towers really isn't financially viable at the moment, is it?
It's not for, if I could call it, the middle market, for working people or middle class or whatever you want, whatever term you want to use. It's still viable in premium inner city locations where developers are going to be able to realise an end price of land plus taxes, fees, charges, levies, all the rest of it, plus building costs, plus. In Brisbane, nearly $2 million. 1.5 is the absolute bottom you could build a 2-bedroom box for now. So what they'll do, they will concentrate their development efforts in the markets where they're going to have the most buyer support, and that is at the upper end. So what you're going to see is that there'll be more supply added at the upper end. Wealthy people always find a way to look after themselves. Michael, I don't have a problem with that. That's just a reality of the market and of life. But at the middle and lower end of the market, you're not going to see medium or high density housing built almost anywhere at the moment, because the cost of delivering the product is more than the market can afford.
That's one of the problems that's going to happen with the build-to-rent developments as well. That will, because of tax incentives, encourage developers, corporations to invest in rental accommodation. But that's not going to come at the affordable end of the market, is it?
No. In fact, I think there was a story in the media today, or anyway, very recently, that indicated that much of the build-to-rent product that's out there in the market at the moment is 20% higher for a one-bedroom and 25 or maybe 30% more expensive for a two-bedroom. I saw Mirvac announce one in Melbourne just before Christmas. It was touted as being a terrific location for young families and students, with rents for a two-bedroom starting at $900 a week.
Wow, that's right. So again, that's one of the new tax benefits that came in the budget, when I guess you and I are going to have to pay that out of our taxes to help encourage developers to build those complexes. But they talked about a couple of 100,000 of those over the next 5 years. It's not going to really move the dial very much. On your Finger on the Pulse blog, and I'll leave a note for that in the show notes, Ross, you gave an example of Vancouver, where increasing housing supply didn't really lead to more affordable housing. Can you share a bit more about this case and what lessons we can learn from it?
Well, lessons learned. I just find it ironic that Vancouver they churn out urbanists who are obviously the best salespeople for Vancouver. And it's a city that has been studied many times, promoted extensively overseas as something of an urbanist miracle because of all of the high-density apartments that have been added. But there's a few things to keep in mind about Vancouver. And the most significant, I think, is that almost year in, year out, in the Demographia Worldwide Survey of Housing, and even according to reports by the Bank of Canada, it is the most unaffordable housing market in the world, perhaps with the exception of a Tokyo or Hong Kong. But it is the last place you would go, or last place I would go, to learn about solving a housing crisis or solving housing with high density supply, because all that's happened to Vancouver since the 1960s or maybe the 1970s is that the Vancouver is a little bit like Sydney or Melbourne in that the council is largely a metropolitan, a small area council. So their skyline is now just absolutely carpet bombed with these 20-plus story apartments, and it has done absolutely nothing for affordability, absolutely nothing at all. Let's not be like Vancouver. I would say to people, why don't we study markets where they've maintained their affordability and their quality of life, and they have environments in terms of climate and so on that are similar to ours. And I would always say, why aren't we looking at places like Austin in Texas, for example? I think the answer is it's just not a sexy place for urbanists to go on these conferences. Let's go study New York or Paris or Vancouver or somewhere else. But if you suggest they actually have a look at somewhere useful, it just doesn't have the same sex appeal, I guess.
Well, you mentioned in your blog about townhouses and low-set apartments in suburban renewal precincts that there'd be a more affordable situation. Could you expand on this a bit?
This is something that's been initiated by the Brisbane City Council, which I think is a great thing, and I chair the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Initiative, which partly led to it. But we're looking at unlocking old industrial areas, old industrial precincts, and allowing them to develop into mixed-use precincts, and that will include housing. And the type of housing won't necessarily be the most expensive high-rise, but it will include townhouses and, three-storey walk-ups and that sort of thing, which are actually reasonably affordable and often quite well located.
And very likely to have better long-term capital appreciation for homeowners and investors because they're going to have a much better land-to-asset ratio than when you build 200 apartments on a small block of land.
Well, yes, and they'll be part, hopefully, of what becomes a very vibrant and desirable precinct. So you're not just doing the housing, you're also doing the other bits that need to go with it.
That's important.
The social infrastructure, the public open space, the transport, the entertainment, the recreation, and so on. So it's not just a unilateral approach. I think the mixed-use precinct approach is going to be the way of the future because, let's face it, the one thing that COVID taught us is that not everyone wants to be in the CBD 5 days a week anymore. We're looking at these opportunities in suburban areas, and I think they do hold the key. But once again, I think rather than incentivising the large institutional developers of build-to-rent product who are going to deliver a product that's more expensive than even market product, so they're building stuff that's at a premium, why aren't we incentivising a different level of developer to develop some of these precincts where you're not seeing individual unit blocks of 200, but you might be seeing a row of townhouses of 30 or something like that. So it's a very different type of market. It's a much more affordable. I guess it doesn't get as much attention in the media headlines, but I think overall it holds a lot more future value for the people who could live there.
Well, it's been the sort of product that we've been producing at Metropole for quite some time now, many years, a couple of decades, because I see people wanting to live in this sort of accommodation, modern accommodation, large accommodation, but on compact blocks, but in gentrifying suburbs. And if you've got all those amenities that you're talking about, you've got your 20-minute neighbourhood right there, haven't you?
Yep, exactly. And that's the key, I think, as well, because as cities grow and we're not building transport anywhere near fast enough, the logical thing is that people will look for places of work closer to where they live. So some of these suburban business districts will provide that solution. So people ideally might have opportunities to walk or cycle only a few kilometres, perhaps, to work, maybe along a creek corridor with an active transport pathway and so on, rather than be faced with jumping in the car and travelling an hour to get to work, which is it's lost its appeal. I don't know why it was ever appealing in the first place, but whatever appeal it was is now gone.
It now has gone. I think it's also got to be remembered that a lot of these migrants who are coming in are not going to be working in the CBD. They're going to be working in education, in healthcare, just in the local shops as well, and the local factories and warehouses and offices. And they're in the suburbs now, aren't they?
Yep, they are. It's exactly right. They're not arriving in their three-piece suits and briefcases swanning around Martin Place, Sydney. That's not where a lot of the population growth is going. So we need to accommodate them in places where there are opportunities. I think I'd love to see our federal government recognise those demand-side pressures they're contributing to, Michael, and develop a strategy around encouraging growth in some of our second-tier regional cities and towns. The only way to do that is to start prioritising infrastructure in those towns, like hospitals, like schools, like universities, like the very things that we all take for granted in cities, and particularly inner cities, are the very same things that would allow those regional towns and cities to attract a lot more people. And if you can attract the people, you'll attract the employers as well.
Well, I always enjoy our chats, Ross. So we started off saying we don't have a housing supply crisis. Yes, we do have a growth crisis, and that's creating an issue with housing supply, but clearly with all the infrastructure issues, soft infrastructure as well as the hard infrastructure, and we're not going to easily build our way out of it, but we'll be back regularly to have a chat about it, and I love the way you poke the bear. Look forward to catching up with you again real soon, Ross.
Thanks again, Michael. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Ross, who's given us a bit of clarity about what's ahead. Now, let me ask you a favour if you did get some benefit from it. If you don't already subscribe to this podcast, click wherever you're listening to this and follow it or subscribe, whatever it says on your podcast app. Do that now, because in a moment I'm going to share my mindset message with you, but that way you're going to be able to get benefit twice a week, as I have a range of significant guests who give us great perspective into the property markets. Now, talking about the property markets, it's very clear at the moment that from all the research houses, it's not just my thoughts, that we have passed the housing market bottom earlier this year. And it's a great opportunity, an opportunity like this to get into the property market at the beginning of a new cycle doesn't happen very often. So if you're considering buying a new home or an investment property, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole to discuss your options? Now, I'm not advocating trying to time the market, but isn't that what most people would like to do? So if the timing is right for you, and we'd only do that by putting a strategic plan together and finding out what you want, what you need, what your finance capacity is. But if it is the right time, hey, why not take advantage of the opportunities the market's offering us? Because I bet when you look back in a year's time, you're going to think, hey, I should have got in then. But be careful. Property investment's a process. It's not an event. So you can't just buy any property and hope to be successful. Formulating a property plan and getting the right advice is more critical now than ever before. So why not have a chat with my team at Metropole, metropole.com.au. And remember, we don't have any properties for sale, but we offer strategic advice and give you direction, results and certainty. As I said, an opportunity to get in at the beginning of a cycle doesn't happen very often.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Today, I'm going to share a bit of a heavier mindset session with you. But pay attention. I hope you'll get some benefit from it. And I'm calling it 3 reasons why you are not your thoughts. Let's go through it. Number 1, the concept I'd like to get across is that your mind's not a camera, it's a projector. Now, what do I mean by that? Look in the mirror. What do you see? You should see your face. But how would you describe it to somebody? Perhaps the person in the mirror is a young person filled with energy, yet also wise with age. The way we see and describe anything is different for every person. We all have our unique experiences and our past conditioning. We're bringing along all that baggage with us. As Michael Neal writes in his book, The Space Within, we live in a world of thought, but we think we live in the world of external experience. The mind's not a camera, it's a projector, he says. We can't tell the difference between an imagined experience in here in your mind and what's really going on out there in the outside world. And that confusion creates a lot of confusion. You see the world as you are, not as it is. And that's part of the reason I spend time discussing these mindset messages with you, so that we get a realistic understanding of what's going on in your head, because the outside world won't change until your inside world does. You've heard me say it before. It's in my Rich Habits, Poor Habits book, and in the podcasts I do. We're all walking around with one foot on an accelerator and one on the brake. We've got empowering beliefs and we've got disempowering beliefs. So we're not really seeing the world as the world is, but we're seeing it as we are due to all our preconditioning, the beliefs, the good and the bad that we carry with us. So understanding what's right and what's wrong is ultimately a matter of perception. So how do you envisage the outside world? How do you assess what's going on there? And as I started to say, it's because of the reticular activating system, the conditioning that you've got that filters things so we see the world as we are, not as it really is. So I guess step 1, I'm trying to mention about the 3 reasons that you're not your thoughts and that you've got to change your thoughts so that we can actually move forward, is that your mind's a projector. It's not a camera. Of course, perception is reality. So if you imagine something to be as it is, then that's your reality. Okay. The second concept I'd like to get across today is that you're constantly going through a system upgrade. If I asked you who you are, you'd likely to start with what you do for a living, or recite a list of your past achievements, or where you've been, or what your values are. But who is the person behind those beliefs, behind those thoughts, behind those ideas? Who are you now, right now, in this moment? It's important to ask this, because where you want to be, where you want to take your profession, your business, your life, your investments, is going to require a different version of you to show up. Remember, your personal wealth will never outgrow your personal growth. So for you to get to the next level, you're going to have to grow to become a different person. Often you need to rip out all your old belief systems that worked, but it only got you to where you got to now, and you've got to build new ones that are relevant. Because if you don't like system upgrades, you're going to be like that BlackBerry, or remember that old phone that's faced extinction. Interestingly, that's why I have had a mentorship program for over 15 years to help people understand their internal wealth operating system, to upgrade their thermostat. And that's one of the extra things that we do at Wealth Retreat. One of the first things we actually do at Wealth Retreat, which is going to be held in November this year, we're going to actually work on people's empowering beliefs and limiting beliefs. So we've got to clear all out the limiting beliefs, instill a whole lot of new empowering beliefs, do a system upgrade on them, and then, and only then, Are they going to be able to take advantage of all the information that we give them to help them? Okay, the third point I just want to get across, or the 3 points I want to get across to you today in this mindset session is pain can feel crippling, or you can use it as a stimulus to growth. In their best-selling book, The Tools, the authors, who are also psychotherapists, said, your experience of pain changes relative to how you react to it. When you move towards it, pain shrinks. When you move away from it, pain grows. If you flee from it, pain pursues you like a monster in the dream. The more pain you can tolerate, the more you can learn. Now, the same sentence could be true if you replace the word pain with fear. Pain and fear will surprise you if you're open to possibilities without knowing how things will unfold. If things are tough right now for you, they won't last. If things are good, unfortunately, they won't stay good forever. The important thing to ask yourself is, what's the lesson in this? Because when you stop living in your thoughts, life becomes an experience. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?